All right, well, I'm glad you're here this evening. We are reading through the book of Revelation, and we are in chapter 12. And I believe we ended up at about verse 13 or 14 last week. That's a good place to start. But quick summary of the beginning of the chapter to get us back into context. This chapter is different from the rest of the book in many ways. And it is, in a lot of ways, sort of a schematic of the entire book of Revelation. So it's a lot of the decisions that we make about how we understand chapter 12 will affect our understanding of the entire book. So chapter 12 begins with a sign, John said, appeared, a woman who was in the heavens and had a crown of 12 stars, the moon at her feet, clothed in the sun. She has a baby, and so we can very easily conclude from the baby being snatched up into heaven to the throne of God that the baby is Jesus. And so this woman must either be Mary or the people of Israel. And the more we read chapter 12, the more we'll be convinced that it's the people of Israel giving birth to the Messiah. And of course, Mary would be part of that. Then we have this other sign, this red dragon, this great red dragon. And John makes it very clear who he is. He is Satan, the ancient serpent, the one who leads the world astray. And what this chapter does is it throws back the curtain of eternity and shows us events that were taking place in the heavenly realms. Whereas when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we get the earthly story, if you will, the earthy story of Jesus and his birth and his ministry. Here we see the cosmic realms and all that is happening. And what's happening behind the scenes, so to speak, in the earthly life of Jesus is this struggle between Satan and not necessarily God, but between Michael and his angels, we're told in Revelation chapter 12. Of course, Satan used to be an angel. He's a fallen angel. And so in many ways, this is an intramural battle between angels. Angels who have fallen because they followed Satan, and those who have not, who follow Michael. Michael's name, by the way, in Hebrew means who is like him, or who is like God, which will kind of spring its head up again here when we get to chapter 13. So at any rate, there's this cosmic struggle that's taking place. The baby, the dragon, Satan tries to destroy the baby, but he fails. And the baby who is going to rule the nations is swept up to heaven. He's at the throne of God. And this battle rages between Satan and his angels and Michael and his angels. Satan loses. No place is found for him in heaven, and he is cast down to the earth. Then, starting in verse 11, we have a hymn, a sort of a psalm by a great voice in heaven. So we get a little background information there. And especially in verse 11, it says that they, being God's people, overcame him, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb and through the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives even to the point of death. So, over and over again in the book of Revelation, we have these references to martyrdom by Christians. And here is another one. Martyrdom is something that, if we see the book of Revelation from a futurist perspective, which I do, and so I'm presenting it that way to you, if we see it from a futurist perspective, what we're reading about is a time just before Jesus returns when persecution will be rampant around the earth against Christians, against God's people. And so martyrdom will also be, normal, in a sense, for those who are followers of Jesus. So Satan is cast down from heaven. He's the accuser of the brothers and sisters in this chapter, but that opportunity has been taken away from him since he no longer has access to heaven. Let's start back in verse 13 then, and it says, "And when the dragon saw that he was thrown to the earth, he dioko," and I think we talked about this last time. This is a word that can legitimately be rendered as either pursued or persecuted. And it means both. Dioko does, but we don't have a good English word that means both pursued and persecuted. So our translators have to decide which of those words they're going to print there. Either one works. Persecuted is probably better because the pursual was done with the idea of persecution. So he persecuted the woman, which gave birth to literally the male. And that sounds a little stark in English, but that's the way that it's written by John when he saw the visions. The male child or the boy sounds a little better in English, and of course that's a reference to Jesus. To make sure that we understand that this is the same woman that we were introduced to earlier in chapter 12, verse 14. And the wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she will be nurtured there times and half a time from the face of the serpent, literally, or from the presence of the serpent is the meaning. And so our English translations probably don't use the word face. The word face is used often in the Bible for the presence of something. If you have a literal translation of the Bible, very often it says the face of God. And that's not saying that God has a physical face, but it's just saying that we're standing in the presence just before God. Yes, sir.
Is that the scripture that I think some people try to twist into seeing America?
I have seen it used that way in the, what was the fellow's name that released the book back in the 1980s, Late Great Planet Earth? Yeah, Hal Lindsey. In the Lindseian way of looking at it, all of these symbols have, some of these symbols have references that are related to the United States of America. And so the eagle, I don't know where I saw this. I may have read it, but it seems like in a movie I saw that the people of God were being ushered off to safety during the tribulation, and you see the tail of the jet go by, and it has an eagle on it as the symbol of the United States of America. And so they were trying to find the United States of America in end-time prophecy. That's probably not very good hermeneutics. Okay, the wings of the eagle here would more likely be found where? Okay, Isaiah talks about them. There's an even better place. But your answer tells me that you think that we should look where? In the Old Testament, and that's exactly right. We shouldn't look in modern day pop culture for the answers to these symbols. It doesn't hurt. It's interesting to do. But that is far from the primary place to go and look for what these symbols mean. And if we force modern day pop culture imagery to be our interpretation of the book of Revelation, we're going to end up being disappointed. Why? I'll tell you why. Because you will eventually be told that you know the date that Jesus is coming back. And everyone so far that has done that has what? They have failed. And apparently they also failed to notice that Jesus said what? No one knows the day. So the Old Testament is the right place to go to understand these symbols. The wings of an eagle, where else can we find those? Yes, ma'am. Exodus chapter 19. She thought she had me, yeah. That's exactly right. The Lord tells Israel when He meets them at the mountain to give them the Ten Commandments and to institute the covenant relationship, He tells them, you yourselves have seen how I bore you on wings like an eagle and brought you to myself. That is the right place to go to look for the proper understanding of the imagery here and in other places in the New Testament. But the Isaiah passage that you're referencing is one of my favorites, Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31. Those who, depending on the translation that you read, wait on the Lord. How does that go? Mount up with wings like eagles. And if you can't do that, you what? If you can't mount up with wings like eagles, what's the next thing you can do? Run. And if you can't run, you can walk and not faint. Absolutely. So it's a great verse, you know. I'd love to mount up with wings like an eagle and fly, but if my flying days are over, then I'm good running. And if my running days are over, then I'm good if I can just walk. Amen? All right. Okay. Getting a little Pentecostal here. I need to rein it in. All right. No danger of that, huh? All right. Here we go. Okay, let's go back to verse 14. So, the wings of the eagle are a symbol that tells us that God is the one who is behind whatever he uses. If he ends up using the United States of America, that's fine. I'm not saying he can't. I'm just saying that that's not what this means. What this means is that ultimately God is the one who's behind it in the same way that he was behind the rescue of Israel out of the land of Egypt. He's going to do the same thing again. This is one of God's favorite motifs, to rescue people out of slavery. Now, since God is sovereign and nothing happens in history apart from his plan, then the slavery itself is part of his plan. Who sent the people of Israel down to Egypt? God did. That is the life of Joseph. Joseph's life, more than perhaps any other in the Bible except Jesus himself, is so filled with the sovereignty of God that it is just astounding. Here's a guy who ends up in prison and God uses to do something good. He ends up being betrayed by his brothers and God uses it to save his brothers. It's the irony of God's sovereignty in the struggles of history. And so it should never surprise us if God leads us through a period of wilderness, or even, and I'm not wishing this on anybody, that even a period of bondage, because his desire is to set us free. Now, if we believe in the sovereignty of God, there is no other way to look at it. None. Yes, it is Satan that's causing the trouble. Yes, it's our sin that caused things to happen. It's our flesh, all of those things. But still, God uses them, knowing that they were going to happen, because he could rein that in and stop it. He doesn't. Why? Because it reveals him as the Redeemer, as the rescuer, and he loves that motif. He's going to do it again at the end of history with this people. Now, who are the, well, let's keep going. Time, times, and half a time. Here's that 3.5 years again that we keep running into that's measured in different ways. Sometimes it's in months, 42 months, sometimes it's in days, 1,260 days. Here it's in years, and this is close to, this is Daniel's way of talking about it. Time, year, times, 2 years, and half a time, half a year, all added up are 3.5 years, which is the last half of the 70th week, for those of you who are keeping up with that. Now, if you don't know what that means, you can come and ask me, or go back and read the book of Daniel, because we've been through that. We're not going to do it tonight. But this is most probably, and again, as a futurist, I see this as a literal 3.5 year period just before the second coming of Jesus Christ, where there is a great persecution that breaks out on God's people. Verse 15, and the serpent, now I'm going to give this to you kind of literally here, all right? It might sound a little wompy-jawed, and your English translation might have smoothed it out a little bit, but here it is, all right? Verse 15, and the serpent cast from his mouth after the woman water like a river, so that it might make her swamped or overwhelmed. Okay, verse 15, and the serpent cast from his mouth after the woman water as or like a river, so that it might make her overwhelmed or swamped. All right, this is a fascinating verse, and it divides everybody up into those who are more literal in their thinking and those who are more symbolic. Let's think about this verse in a symbolic way first. If this is a symbolism, what might it mean? The mouth of the serpent, water overwhelming the woman, the people of God. How would we interpret that? What would it be referring to in real terms? An army? Okay, possibly. And so why would the mouth and the water motif be there? Not sure? Water often is used in the Bible. Large bodies of water are often used for large populations, so that's possible. Usually the sea instead of a river. What else could it be? What comes from the mouth? Okay, yeah, and the serpent, Satan is good at that. So what some people see this as the serpent or Satan in the end times using some kind of torrent of lies, a campaign of lies against God's people on earth to overwhelm them and to destroy them. Does that make sense? Yeah, it makes perfect sense. You know, that works. Of course, you know me. I'm literal Richard. I'm looking for something possibly that could be a little bit more literal. So let's literal would be obvious, right? It's kind of strange, but it's obvious. There's a river that causes a problem. Maybe the mouth part is that he gives the command, and the river is released somehow. There's many different ways that we could look at this. It's almost endless. But let's go on and see if anything else helps us. Verse 16. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river, which the dragon cast from his mouth. Now, this kind of changes things a little bit, doesn't it? Now we have the earth in its mouth swallowing this river, this water, to help the woman. And did you notice what happened with Satan there? He went from being the serpent to being the dragon. And anytime that happens, when you're doing a real slow, deep Bible study, first of all, you want to notice things like that. And the only way you can notice them is to read very, very carefully. You're not going to notice that if you just go zipping through. And there's a time for zipping through. Zipping through reading is good because you get the big picture. So I'm not saying that that's bad. It's just that there's a time for it. Okay. There's also a time to just really just stop. And I'm going to tell you, one of the ways to notice things is to write them out. And I suspect that is almost a completely dead and lost discipline with us. It's one that I've tried to resurrect several times in my life, and I've resurrected it again now and use it in my study, where I get yellow pieces of paper out and just write things down. There's no other need to write them down other than just to know them better, because there's something about writing it down that makes you know it better. And sometimes when I'm just in a bad mood and don't want to write it down, I'll type it up on my computer. It's almost the same thing. Not exactly. There's something about scratching out those letters. But it's still better than just reading it. Because when you read it, you're still not making a real connection to those words. When you begin to type it or write it, something different happens. And you start to notice something. If you want to know whether or not you've got something memorized, here's the greatest test of all. What is it? Write it down and see if you can write it down. If you can't write it down, you realize right away, I don't have that memorized. And if you keep writing it down, though, you will have it memorized. Now, it can have bad mental connotations if you're somebody like me. If you're like me, you could have flashbacks of being in second grade and having to write, I will not talk, I will not talk, I will not talk, okay? But once we get past that, oh, Gene, you had to write those? No. Oh, well, I don't see why. I had to write those so often, Gene. I had to write those so often. I'm going to bare my soul here, all right? I had to write those so often that I would just sit down in my spare time and write them ahead of time, okay? I'm not kidding. Yeah. A couple of times my teachers were wondering how I got it done so fast, because they'd give them to me in the hundreds. They'd write it 200 times, but yeah. Yeah, I see how this is going to be. All right, now how did we get from the serpent to okay. The devil is definitely in the conversation tonight, yeah. Now, when you're writing something down or reading very, very slow, you'll notice those shifts, like here from the serpent to the dragon. And then you can stop and ask yourself, why? Why did the Holy Spirit have John write the serpent in one place and the dragon in another one? And having studied this chapter many, many times, that's one of the questions that I've asked many times. I'm not sure I've come up with a satisfactory answer. Yes, sir? Right, and it switches to the serpent and switches back to the dragon. And so, is there a reason for that? Some people would say, no, he's just bored. He wants to use a different word. But I tend to back away from that. It could be. Paul says it's to remind us of how powerful he is. All right. Okay, that he's more than just one. That is the answer that I came to. That Satan has a lot of faces, and that's not necessarily bad because Jesus has a lot of names too, and those are good. It doesn't mean he's two-faced, but I think in Satan's case, it does mean that evil comes to us in many different forms with many, many different faces, and we need to be aware of that. So that's a really good answer. Anybody else? It does. Very good. That's very good. So Jackie, if you didn't hear that, she's pointing out that when it says serpent, it makes us think about Satan in Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden, and that he used lies to overwhelm the woman, Eve. And a lot of people point that out, Jackie. Your theology's clicking good tonight. And they say that that's a reason to believe that this is symbolic and not literal. And there are plenty of lies told about the Israelites, absolutely, because they are the woman, if we're right, and he wants to destroy her offspring. Now, but how does verse 16 maybe change the way we think about it? Verse 16 makes it sound more like what? Symbolic or literal? To me, verse 16 shifts the balance a little bit. If verse 15 was by itself, then I would be more open to a symbolic understanding. But when I read verse 16, I have a hard time trying to figure out what that would symbolize. Well, it seems, though, that the earth is the earth. And that's the aggravation of apocalyptic literature, because not everything stands for something else. But the earth can stand for those who dwell in it. The what? The earthquakes cause the earth to open, and you're doing very good there, Marie. You're going back to the Old Testament, to Ai when the ground opened up, or even there are other places and people were swallowed up. And so the water there could potentially be enemies who are swallowed up by the earth. But I think what you're seeing here with our conversation is that the possibilities are multitudinous, aren't they? There's a lot of different ways that we could look at this, and it could end up causing us to be frustrated. But I always think about a time that we went to Dayton, Ohio. And my dad and I were in the car. Now, my dad and I have this in common. We both have a pretty good sense of direction. Now, I don't want to brag about it because you'll find me lost somewhere. I said pretty good, all right? That's not 100%. We have a pretty good sense of direction. I'm the kind of guy that will drive into a city and start trying to drive around without looking at a map. Now, I know that doesn't mean anything anymore, because now you just turn your GPS on and it talks to you. But you know what? That bothers me. I don't like that. So anyway, we were in Dayton, and we wanted to take Andy to a Air Force museum, which is in Dayton, Ohio. It's quite the place. None of us had ever been there. In fact, none of us had ever been in Dayton, Ohio, in our lives. And not only was there an Air Force museum in Dayton, there is an Air Force base in Dayton. So there's signs up all over the place sending you to one of the two places, either the Air Force base or the Air Force museum. And since we had never been there, the signs to us could have been interpreted in different ways. Let's just put it that way, all right? Now, and my dad interpreted them one way, and I interpreted them another way. His interpretation was stay on the freeway, and mine was get off at the next exit. You've been there, okay? You've been in the car when this happens before, right? You know what that conversation is like. And I was the driver, so guess what? Yeah, that's right. I got to do it my way. If he'd have been driving, we'd have gone his way. But we eventually ended up, as we got closer and closer, we actually saw the museum. And once we saw the museum, then we both agreed, for the most part, how to get there. And we finally showed up and made it to the museum. Now, it dawned on me years ago that Christians reading the book of Revelation are a lot like that. We don't all see the signs the same way. In fact, sometimes we see them totally opposite. Sometimes we see them as going what would seem to be opposite directions. And I'm not saying both people are right. I think that somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong. But for all of us who are truly followers of Jesus Christ, as we get closer to the museum, if you will, as we get closer to the end, it's going to become clearer and clearer what these signs are telling us. And it's going to be painfully obvious at some point what these things are saying and what they mean. So my point is this: don't let it bother you too much if you can't come up with an actual interpretation for every one of these symbols in the book of Revelation. There's coming a day when we'll know what all of these things mean. And that's just an act of faith. We still read because we can still learn from it, and then we have that information in our spirits, ready to be used and called up by the Holy Spirit when the day comes. All right, let's see if we can finish up this chapter. I want to talk about John Chow tonight, that missionary. Have y'all read about him? John, some of you have, some of you haven't. Let's read the rest of this chapter real quick. Verse 17. And the dragon was enraged at the woman and went out to make war with the rest of her seed, those keeping the commandments of God and having the testimony of Jesus. Now, very quickly, before we look at verse 17, verse 18 is confused in a lot of the older manuscripts of the New Testament. And it's also, you can make a case for it being the end of chapter 12. It looks more like the beginning of chapter 13 than it does the end of chapter 12. And so different Bibles format it differently. I think the old NIV puts it at the beginning of chapter 13, but puts chapter 12 numbers on it or something like that. It's a little confusing. But that's not unusual because the Bible often uses what I call hinge verses. Hinge verses. Matthew uses hinge verses. Hinge verses are verses between two obvious literary sections, and that one verse could really be taken with the section before it, and it could be taken with the section after it, both. And so it's when you format the Bible, you have to decide, especially if like it's a chapter break, you just have to decide. Are you going to put it in chapter 24 or are you going to put it in chapter 23? That doesn't mean that it doesn't have another function to it. And this is one of those verses. But let's go back to verse 17. So the dragon is angry here at the woman. That's the people of God, we believe, particularly Israel. And he goes out to make war with the rest of her seed. Now, this is where we get into interpretive debate, discussion, dialogue. Who is or who are the rest of the seed? Well, there's several different ways to answer that, and a lot of it depends on your preconceived notion of how the book of Revelation is unfolding. If you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, then you believe that the church is gone from the earth at this point. And so the rest of the seed has to somehow be some other class of Israelite believers. These would be Messianic Jews. In other words, Jewish people ethnically who have accepted the fact that Jesus really is the Messiah. If you do not believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, then the rest of the seed could be the Jewish Gentile church, which is still on the earth, struggling through the Great Tribulation. So your preconceived notions probably have more to do with how you see this verse than what's in the verse itself. Because the fact is, when you look at Revelation chapter 12, it just doesn't answer these questions. It gives us the facts and lets us take them and talk about them. But I want to talk about another dynamic. We'll come back to that as we go through. We still got all the way to chapter 21, 22 of Revelation, so there'll be other opportunities for us to talk about that. I want to talk about something else tonight in application of all of this. What we're seeing here, and we're going to see definitely in chapter 13, is a time that Jesus talked about is coming when you will be hated by all nations, you being believers. There will be a time at the end of history, I believe, that there will be a time when Christians will be persecuted wherever they are. There'll be no place for them among the civilized nations. Now, this book says, this chapter says that there will be a place made for them, but it's a place in the wilderness, and it's a place made by God. By the way, I asked you a question at the end of last week about recapitulation. Did any of you read that and find it? Or did you even remember it? There's a recapitulation in here that I want you to notice real quickly. In chapter 12, if you look at verse, is it 5 or 6? 6. In verse 6 it says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where there she has a place prepared for her by God, so that there they might nurture her 1,260 days." And then it goes on and tells other part of the story. Verse 6 is being unpacked by verses 13 through 17. Okay, take that away and think about it. Verse 6 is being unpacked by verses 13 through 17. And I'm going to go further and say that chapters 13 and 14 will be further unpacking that same period of time. Okay, you think about that, and we'll talk more about it as we go along. But here, let's talk about John Chau for a minute and how the world views Christians. John Chau and how the world views Christians. What do you know about John Chau already? He was a missionary. Okay, what else? John Chau was a missionary and is being used because he is dead. Now, it may turn out that he's not dead, but there's eyewitness evidence that he's dead. Okay, what else do we know about John Chau? John Chau broke the law. All right. John Chau sounds like he was a believer. Yeah, well, it was. Okay, so John Chau may have been a pseudo-Christian missionary thrill seeker. Might be one way of putting that. Jack? Okay, now you may not have heard what Jack said, but he just gave us some good background. It's a people on a small island off of India, 100 miles away from India, something like that. And the population of the people is very, very small too. I think the population of this people is like 150 or something. And it's a very, very primitive group, and they, by their own choice, want no contact with the modern world. And the Indian government, who we would consider to be the authorities over this part of the world, has outlawed any contact with them. All right, so that's the setting. And the reasons that you gave, there are cultural reasons that people from civilized world, if they went into their population, could very easily bring disease, that with such a small population could wipe out the whole population. And plus, they had decided on their own that they didn't want any contact, and so the Indian government agreed with that, so it's just illegal to have anything to do with them. So now comes along John Chau, who is part of a Christian missionary group that's a little extreme, and there are groups who have adopted more dangerous styles of missionary work where they go into places in the world where these primitive peoples actually still live, don't have written languages. Wycliffe is a group that goes into these areas. Now, I'm not equating Wycliffe with John Chau's group, so don't do that. I'm using Wycliffe as an example. What Wycliffe does is they will go into an area like this, and if they are invited, and there's a difference between what Wycliffe does and what John Chau did, if they're invited, they will stay, they will learn the language, because the language is unwritten, and they will figure out a way to write the language, teach the people their own language in written form, and then translate the New Testament first and then the entire Bible into their language and share the gospel with them. It can be a very long process, sometimes decades. And Wycliffe Bible translators have gone and lived with some of these people, sometimes for decades, to do this. Now, John Chau was doing something a little bit different. John Chau wanted to bring the gospel to these people, and it sounds like from his diaries that he understood that what he was doing was illegal, but he did it anyway. Now, a lot of people have a problem with that. That could do, I can hear people saying, well, that may do more harm than good from Christian missions. But before we pass judgment on that particular matter, let's think back to communist Russia for a moment. And what were missionaries doing during Stalin era, for instance? And was that legal? That smuggle Bibles. I'm sorry, I missed the first word. Absolutely, they were smuggling Bibles. It was illegal. Same thing happened in China. So Christians don't necessarily believe that breaking a local rule or law is automatically wrong when it comes to doing mission work. Is there a biblical basis for that? Very early in the church life, Peter said, we've got to obey God other than you, because they said, quit telling people about Jesus. But
if he's running the risk of wiping out an entire tribe, I mean, is it really for sharing the gospel, or is it just for a feather in your cap? I don't know. He risks wiping out their tribe, or he lets go to hell. I mean, there's not really yeah. Because if they don't hear the gospel and they don't know Jesus,
and that's what John Chau would have said, absolutely. So there are different things that have to be balanced, but it's not necessarily the Christian policy to not do something just because it's illegal, is my point, okay? But what else did John Chau do that maybe we could be critical of and find a biblical basis for it? What else did he do that didn't really follow? Jesus sent his followers out, and he gave them certain instructions. Well, that's... They shot an arrow at him, yeah. Okay. All right, that's... What about Jim Elliot? Should he have given up? That's a good point, but it's arguable. I think there's one that's not even arguable that we haven't said yet. When Jesus sent his disciples out, Jack? Mm-hmm. He got some other people in trouble. Yeah. It was illegal to take anyone out there, and he persuaded some fishermen to take him out there, and so now they've been arrested. Now, if he wants to take the risk himself, that's one thing. But asking others to take that risk, that might be something we could criticize. Yes, ma'am.
When talking in English, like they're not gonna automatically understand what he was saying.
That's correct. That's correct. I don't know what his long-term plan was. I'm not sure if anybody does.
Like people going in and learning their language.
That would be Wycliffe, and he was not part of Wycliffe.
I mean, for him to just be speaking English, they're not gonna understand what he was saying.
I don't know what his long-term plan was. I'm not sure that he wrote that down in his diaries.
How did Tammy not have it? The first time Jesus sent out the disciples, he told them that if they were welcome to stay with him.
Yeah,
And he said that if you're not, to shake the dust off.
absolutely. Yeah, but Kevin's point's well made too. Sometimes a little persistence before shaking off the dust is not necessarily wrong. And the fact that he lost his life isn't necessarily wrong either. We can't say that because we believe that sometimes we're called to martyrdom. Look at verse 11 in chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. By the blood of the Lamb and their testimony, and they didn't love their lives even to the point of death. Chow didn't want to die based on his diaries, but he was willing to. Karen. Thank you. Very good. I think this is the most critical error that John Chow made, because you can argue almost everything else. You can say, well, it was against the law. Well, sometimes Christians do things against the law. You could say that, well, he lost his life. Well, Christians sometimes do lose their lives. Well, he risked them losing their lives. Well, that's a little bit newer. We could argue that. But there's one thing we can't argue. He didn't go 2 by 2. He decided to do it by himself. And I think that when we're doing something by ourselves, especially something as radical and dangerous as what John Chow was engaged in, that's a sign that we need to check ourselves and move back and think it through a little bit more. So maybe he was a thrill seeker. I don't know. Yes?
This isn't biblical, basing it biblically. And you do have to be careful about what I'm fixing to say. But I'm thinking of a particular person named Bruce Olson, but there have been others that have indeed gone by themselves to lawless places that the authorities discourage, if not outlawed, but and that have at first made enemies of the native people, but then have won them for Christ,
Mm-hmm.
and that have borne the fruit of it over years and generations.
So Kevin is pointing out some actual incidents where somebody did go on their own and it turned out okay. Again, it's what God only knows. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Almost like when it says, you make your plans and you try to get God to go along with it.
Yeah, we'll never be able to sit down in this life and talk to John and try to gauge what his motives were. He was a young man. I think he was in his 20s. And nothing against people in their 20s, but it's always good to have some wisdom and some depth. And I don't know how much of that he had behind him. There are people who are continuing to investigate all that happened to try to understand it. And one thing that they've discovered is that he didn't just do this on a lark. He was well trained. He had spent years of training, so he had thought about this. It wasn't something that he just woke up one morning and decided to do. Paul? Not to my knowledge. Hit his Bible, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know, Butch. Okay. But here's the thing that I want to point out to you to just kind of wrap this up. Obviously, what a lot of Christians are saying is that John did what we just did. He sparked a healthy conversation about how we do missions. And there's no doubt about that. It was awful costly for him to do that. And I don't know if that's what he was trying to do, but there's no doubt that that's one of the things that will be a result. But here's my reason for bringing it up with Revelation chapter 12 is this. There's a time coming when Christians, in all that we hold dear and believe, is going to be considered wrong and hated. And already in this debate, I think Jack brought it out well in his description, the debate in many ways is about saving the culture of the people. There's nothing about the soul that whatever they believe about invisible realities now, that's their business, and nobody has any business trying to persuade them differently. Now, if we continue to hold true to the Great Commission that Jesus gave us, that's exactly what we do, is try to persuade people that if they're not believing what the Bible says, that they're wrong. That is increasingly something that is considered a faux pas in our culture. So, yes, sir? I'm saying that it's a possibility that our commitment to the Great Commission and our obedience to Jesus may be the very thing that brings us into conflict with the entire world. Absolutely. And John Chow's story demonstrates this. Go back and read some of the articles now and see if you don't see what I'm seeing there, and think about it. Let's at least honor what he did by thinking our way through these missions again. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly right. When Jim Elliot died, it looked like it was the end of the story, but it wasn't, was it? That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. The two stories aren't the same, but Kathleen's point is well taken. We don't know how this story is going to end yet, and we should follow it. It may take decades to find out exactly how it's going to end. All right, I've taken way too much time, so let's pray, we'll sing, and take a break before choir practice. Thank you for being here tonight. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word and your work in this world, God, and we trust you with history. We know you're sovereign. We know that everything is developing exactly as you planned it. And we're happy to be a part of what you're doing. We want to be a part. We want to be faithful. Show us how we fit in and what it is we're to do. In Jesus' name, amen.